Alaska, a land where human ambition often has to surrender to the harsh laws of nature. Behind its frozen landscapes lie traces of civilization now brought to a stop. Rusting machines, houses sinking into the ground, and roads no longer traveled. Some places were abandoned overnight because of disaster, while others slowly decayed because of economic failure and extreme isolation. But Alaska's ghost towns are not just stories from the past. Today, several modern settlements are fighting against time, threatened with disappearing completely from the map because of unavoidable geological change. This is the story of 15 places in Alaska that have already become history, and others now heading toward the same fate. This massive red structure, 14 stories tall, stands in sharp contrast against the bluish-white backdrop of Kennecott Glacier. Kennecott is Alaska's grandest monument to industrial failure. In the early 20th century, it was the center of one of the richest copper mines in the world, generating millions of dollars in profit for the company that ran it. But once the copper reserves ran low in 1938, the company abruptly shut everything down. One final train carried the residents away, leaving behind buildings filled with work tools, documents, and household furniture, as if they had only stepped out for lunch and never returned. Nearby, McCarthy served as the wild side for miners looking for entertainment. Today, Kennecott is managed as a National Historic Site, while McCarthy is home to a handful of people who resist modernity. The silence in Kennecott feels deeply unsettling. The creak of old wood in the mountain wind is a reminder that no amount of wealth can keep people from leaving once nature stops giving. Kennecott's silence may have come from economics, but what happened to Portage was pure fury from the earth. About an hour from Anchorage, there is a landscape known as the Ghost Forest. Dead spruce trees, pale gray and leafless, stand stiffly above saltwater marshes. These are the remains of Portage, a town destroyed within minutes on Good Friday in 1964. A 9.2 magnitude earthquake, the largest in North American history, caused the land in Portage to drop sharply by about 2 to 3 meters. As a result, seawater from the tidal channel pushed inland, flooding the town and poisoning tree roots with salt. No buildings remain except for foundation ruins that occasionally appear at low tide. Portage was not abandoned because of the economy, but because the ground beneath it physically sank below sea level. Today, travelers often pass through the former town without realizing that beneath the mud once stood a busy settlement. Meanwhile, Portlock carries a different story from other ghost towns in Alaska. While other towns died because of economics or earthquakes, this one was abandoned because of fear. Located at the edge of the Kenai Peninsula, this once prosperous fishing village began to be abandoned on a large scale in the 1940s. The cause was a series of reports about mysterious disappearances and the discovery of badly mutilated bodies in the surrounding forest. Locals believed they were being hunted by Nantianak, a forest-dwelling creature from Aleutian legend. The terror felt so real that the local post office closed in 1950, marking the end of life there. To this day, Portlock remains a place people avoid. The remaining wooden buildings have collapsed and are covered in thick moss, creating a heavy atmosphere for anyone brave enough to approach by boat. Next is Dyea, a town that once served as the main starting point for thousands of gold seekers trying to cross the legendary Chilkoot Trail into the Yukon. In 1898, the town had dozens of crowded hotels, restaurants, and bars. But Dyea's glory collapsed almost instantly when the White Pass and Yukon Route Railway was built in the neighboring town of Skagway. Economically, Dyea became irrelevant in a very short time. A major fire and river flooding later destroyed what was left. Today, almost no buildings remain standing. What you find instead is the Gold Seekers Cemetery and a few rotting dock pilings along the water. Dyea stands as proof of how quickly a town can go from the center of the world's attention to a silent forest when modern infrastructure chooses another route. Only a few minutes from busy Juneau, Alaska's capital, sit the quiet ruins of Treadwell. In the early 1900s, this was one of the most advanced undersea gold mining complexes, employing thousands of people. At its peak, Treadwell even had a heated indoor swimming pool, a luxury almost unimaginable in Alaska at the time. But disaster struck in 1917 when the mine tunnels beneath the sea collapsed and flooded the entire complex with salt water. No one was killed, but the massive machines were buried forever. A major fire a few years later burned down the remaining buildings above ground. Today, visitors can walk among huge concrete foundations and see the remains of heavy equipment slowly merging with the roots of the rainforest. That same power of the sea also caused the death of this town. Afognak was once a quiet village in the Kodiak Islands, home to Russian Aleutian descendants who lived from the ocean. Its destruction happened in an instant in March 1964. After the great earthquake struck, a series of giant tsunamis swept through the village. Although many residents survived, their infrastructure was completely destroyed, and the land was contaminated by seawater. Instead of rebuilding in the same place, the entire community chose to move to a higher location, now known as Port Lions. The old village of Afognak is now a forbidden zone, filled with the ruins of houses caught in the trees, and forests growing over the former roads. This place is a reminder that for Alaska's coastal residents, the greatest threat often comes from the same sea that has sustained them. Moving far west into the Aleutian Islands, we find Unga. In the late 1800s, Unga was the most important settlement in the area. But as the mines failed and the fish canning industry moved elsewhere, the population dropped sharply until the last residents finally left in 1969. What makes Unga unique is how its buildings remained intact for so long because of the cold air. An old Orthodox church with its onion dome stood for decades before finally surrendering to the extreme weather. Walking through Unga today feels like entering a forgotten museum. Old plates may still sit on the shelves of houses whose roofs are already gone. If Unga feels remote, then Ukivok is the definition of impossibility. Looking at photos of Ukivok is enough to stop anyone in their tracks. This village sits on the steep cliffside of King Island in the Bering Sea, where wooden houses were built on tall stilts so they would not slide into the ocean. For centuries, the Inupiat people lived here, hunting seals and walruses. But in the 1950s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs closed the island's only school and forced children to attend school on the mainland. Without a school or access to health services, residents eventually left their cliffside village in the 1960s. Those stilt houses are still here, somehow clinging to the mountainside, slowly collapsing under constant storm winds. Ukivok is the most visually dramatic ghost town in Alaska, and perhaps even in the United States. Moving from the extreme coastline to the interior near the Canadian border, we find Fort Egbert in the town of Eagle. Fort Egbert is known as a remnant of the United States military presence during the Yukon Gold Rush era. In 1900, the fort was an important communication hub, connecting Alaska to the outside world through thousands of miles of telegraph cable. Once the gold rush ended, the military importance of the site faded away. Most of the buildings were dismantled or left to collapse. Although several structures have been restored by the federal government, much of the fort area remains a quiet grassland with the remains of leaning barracks, creating a powerful feeling of isolation. Even so, there are still people who enjoy exploring this place. Another trace of devotion left behind in the interior is Pilgrim Hot Springs. It was once an oasis in the middle of frozen tundra. In the early 1900s, a Catholic mission built an orphanage and school here, using natural hot springs to warm the buildings and grow vegetables in greenhouses. The place even became an important refuge during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic that swept through Alaska native villages. But after the mission closed in the 1940s, the complex was slowly abandoned. Today, a large wooden building with classic architecture stands empty among tall trees, surrounded by hot steam that keeps rising from the ground. This place feels like a silent witness to how humans once tried to conquer the Arctic cold with the simplest but most effective technology. Leaving the past behind and moving into the present, we arrive in Whittier. This city is a geographic anomaly. Imagine this. Whittier can only be reached through a 4-kilometer single-lane tunnel that cuts through a mountain. Even more unique, almost all of its residents live in one large building called Begich Towers. But the main attraction for urban explorers is the abandoned Buckner building nearby. Built in 1953 as a city under one roof for the United States military during the Cold War, the building had everything: a hospital, theater, bowling alley, and even jail cells. But the military left it only 7 years later after realizing that maintaining it in Alaska's brutal climate was too expensive. Today, the Buckner building is a giant concrete shell filled with asbestos and mold. It is a real symbol of a threatened town. If Whittier's main structure ever suffered similar damage, the entire community could disappear. Like Whittier, Seward is a living city, but it holds a ghost in its middle. That ghost is Jesse Lee Home, a large concrete building with a haunting presence. Built in the 1920s as an orphanage, it has major historical value because this is where Benny Benson, an orphan teenager, first designed the Alaska flag. The building was badly damaged by the 1964 earthquake and has been left to decay ever since. Restoration efforts have often failed because of huge costs and political debate. The building is often seen as an example of how a historic site can become a ghost inside a living city, a silent reminder of a noble past, now at risk of being completely destroyed if nothing is done soon. Its location is even seen by some as a sign of declining care for history, which could lead to further neglect of the surrounding area. Next, unlike ghost towns from the past, Newtok is a town dying right in front of us. Located along the Ninglick River, Newtok is one of the most extreme examples of climate displacement in the United States. Thawing permafrost, the layer of ground that is supposed to stay frozen forever has turned the land beneath its buildings into liquid mud. Every year, the river eats up to 20 meters of land, carrying residents' homes straight into the water. The government has begun moving residents gradually to a new site called Murtarvik, but the process is slow and expensive. In Newtok, people live among broken pipes and sharply leaning buildings. This is a settlement that literally disappears from the map every time a storm arrives. A nearly identical fate is also hitting Shishmaref, located on a small barrier island in the Chukchi Sea. Its existence is a miracle now at risk of vanishing. The island keeps shrinking because the sea ice that used to protect the coast from storms now forms later and melts faster. As a result, large waves strike the edge of town directly, eroding the land and sending homes into the sea. Residents of Shishmaref have voted to fully relocate to the mainland, but the cost is estimated to reach hundreds of millions of dollars. For now, they survive by building large rock seawalls along the coast. Life here feels like waiting for an execution. Every fall storm could be the final one that makes the town no longer livable. To close this list, we arrive in Kivalina, a settlement at the tip of a very narrow sand spit. It appears to share the same grim fate as Shishmaref. With rising sea levels and the loss of ice protection, Kivalina is predicted to be completely underwater in less than a decade. What makes the situation here even more tragic is the clean water crisis. Because of eroding land and poor infrastructure, residents often struggle to get safe drinking water. Relocation efforts keep running into funding problems. In Kivalina, every day is a fight to defend the right to ancestral land that is physically being erased from the earth by global climate change. These towns prove that in Alaska, human presence is only temporary. From the grandeur of Kennecott to Newtok slowly sinking away, each place tells the same cycle. Arrival filled with ambition, struggle against the forces of nature, and finally, a quiet departure. Looking at these ruins is not just nostalgia for the past, but a reflection on the fragility of our civilization today. In the end, when nature begins taking back what it once lent, we are reminded that the world map is never truly permanent. Alaska will keep producing new ghost towns as long as humans keep trying to force their will onto a landscape that can never be tamed.